All right. This thing on. Tap, 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 tap. Hello. All right. Well, welcome back, everybody. Sorry I wasn't here yesterday, but I am here now. Slightly late, but here. And we're going to continue on with the Arabian Nights and the Tales of Scheherazade. The next one we're going to be reading will be a tale about the three sisters. We've completed the 7 Voyages of Sinbad, so moving on to a new story in the anthology. I think it's technically an anthology, a collection of stories with a similar theme. Well, I suppose in most anthologies it's different authors. How is everyone today, by the way? Hope everyone's doing well, staying safe, unsick, and unplagued. I'm being harassed by the Vela, although I don't seem to see her in here. So, harassment without actually being present in the chat. She's DMing me, giving me grief for being late. Oh, there she is. I guess now you get to all see her giving me grief. Do love you, but having difficulties. I seem to have lost the bookmark. Right, here we go. I think I found it. Wow, Three Sisters is a long one. Okay. This may be the longest of the stories in the Arabian Nights yet. Let's see. Hello, Sparky. How are you? Hopefully you're not going to give me a hard time like Vela was. Is there a little dude too? Gecko! Hey, Gecko. I'm glad you're here. Very glad you're here. All right. So, the story of the three sisters. Oh, let me pour my tea so it has a chance to cool enough to drink. Aww. Thank you, Sparky. I'm glad you enjoy it. There once was a sultan of Persia named Kunu Shah, who often walked in disguise through the city, attended by his trusty Grand Vizier, and met with many adventures. Once, while passing through the poorer part of the town, he heard loud voices proceeding from a certain house, and coming closer, he saw through the window 3 sisters sitting on a sofa conversing together after supper. From what the eldest was saying, he discovered that the subject of the conversation was wishes. My wish, she was saying, is to have the Sultan's baker for my husband, and then I shall eat my fill of that excellent bread called the Sultan's bread. Let us see if your tastes are as good as mine. The second sister said, I wish I were the wife of the Sultan's chief cook, for then I could eat all sorts of delicious food. But I should not want any of the Sultan's bread, for I am sure it must be quite common in the palace. So you see that I have better taste than you." The youngest sister, who was very beautiful and more charming and more witty than the two elder sisters, spoke in her turn. "For my part, sisters," said she, "my desires take a higher flight. I wish to be the Sultan's queen consort. I would make him father of a prince, whose hair should be gold on one side of his head, and silver on the other. When he cried, the tears from his eyes should be pearls, and when he smiled, his vermilion lips should lock like a rosebud fresh blown." Pearl tears actually sounds really painful. Can you imagine trying to squeeze that out of your, tear ducts? Ow. The three sisters' wishes, particularly that of the youngest, seemed so singular to the Sultan that he resolved to gratify them. So he charged his Grand Vizier to take note of the house and bring the three sisters before him the following day. Accordingly, the Grand Vizier brought the three sisters to the palace and presented them to the Sultan, who said, "Do you remember the wishes that you expressed last night when you were all in such a merry mood? Speak the truth, for I must know what those wishes were." At these unexpected words, the three sisters were much embarrassed and cast down their eyes and blushed. But fear of offending the Sultan kept them silent. The Sultan, perceiving their confusion, then said, "Have no fear, for I did not send for you to distress you, since I know already what your wishes were. You," he added, turning to the youngest sister, "shall have your desire and become my wife today. And you," he continued, addressing the other two, "shall also be married to my chief baker and my cook." The three weddings were all celebrated that day, as the Sultan had resolved. The youngest sisters took place with all the rejoicing and splendor befitting the marriage of a Sultan of Persia, and those of the other two sisters in a humbler manner, as befitted the quality and rank of their husbands, the chief baker and the head cook. The two elder sisters felt strongly the great difference between their marriages and that of their younger sister. Accordingly, they gave themselves up to jealousy, and frequently planned how they might revenge themselves on the queen. But they continued to flatter her, and show every sign of affection and respect. In course of time, the queen gave birth to a young prince, as bright as the day. But the sisters, to whom the child's care was entrusted, wrapped him up and placed him in a basket and let it float away on a canal that ran near the palace, and announced that the queen's child was nothing but a little dog. This news made the Sultan very angry. Meanwhile, the basket containing the little prince was carried by the stream toward the garden of the palace. By chance, the keeper of the Sultan's gardens was walking beside the canal, and perceiving the floating basket, called to a gardener, who with his rake drew the basket to the side of the canal and handed it to him. The keeper of the gardens was greatly surprised when he saw the child, which, though only just born, already had fine features. Although he had been married several years, the keeper of the gardens had not been blessed with children. Accordingly, taking the child, he returned to his house and went at once to his wife's apartment. "Wife," said he, "as we have no children of our own, God has sent us one. Provide him with a nurse, and take every care of him, for from this moment I acknowledge him as our son." Because babies just poof, appear out of nowhere. No stork needed. Just, basket, baby, boom, done. It's not like anybody working in the palace would be aware of any particular baby that had been recently born and then gone missing mysteriously. The following year, the queen consort gave birth to a second little prince, whom the unnatural sisters exposed in the same way in a basket, and set him adrift in the canal, pretending this time that the child proved to be nothing but a cat. Luckily, the keeper of the gardens happened once again to be walking by the canal side, carried the second child to his wife, and charged her to take as good care of it as of the former. The Sultan of Persia was this time more angry with the queen than before, and she would have felt the consequences of his anger if the Grand Vizier had not interceded for her. The next year, the queen gave birth to a princess who suffered the same fate as her two brothers. But like them, she was saved from death by the compassion and charity of the keeper of the gardens. This time, the two sisters reported that the third child had turned out to be only a stick of wood, which they produced in proof of their falsehood. Gnu Shah could no longer contain himself at this third disappointment. He ordered a small shed to be built near the chief mosque, and here he imprisoned the queen so that she might be subject to the scorn of all who passed by. This ill usage she bore with patient resignation. Meanwhile, the two princes and the princess were brought up by the keeper of the gardens and his wife, with all the tenderness of a father and mother. As they grew up, they all three showed marks of superior dignity, such as belongs to noble birth. All this increased the affection of the keeper and his wife, who called the eldest prince Bahman, and the second Perviz, both of them being names of former sultans, and the princess they called Parizade, a name that had also been borne by many princesses. As soon as the two princes were old enough, the keeper of the gardens provided masters to teach them to read and write. And since the princess their sister showed a great desire to learn, he employed the same master to teach her also. Her natural quickness soon made her as proficient as her brothers. She learned to sing and to play upon various instruments, and when the princes were learning to ride, she went through all the exercises with them, learning to ride, to bend the bow, and throw the javelin, and often outdid them in the race and other contests of agility. The keeper of the gardens was so delighted to find that his adopted children so well repaid the care and expense of their education, that he decided to go to even greater expense, and purchased a country seat at a short distance from the city. This he furnished in the richest manner, adding a large park stocked with fallow deer, so that the princes and princess might divert themselves with hunting when they chose. When this country seat was finished, the keeper of the gardens went and cast himself at the sultan's feet, and pleading his long service and the infirmities of age, begged permission to resign his charge and retire. The sultan, having granted his request, the keeper of the gardens retired with his adopted children to his new country home. His wife had been dead some years, and he himself had lived in his new abode scarcely 6 months, when death came upon him so suddenly that he had no time to give his foster children any account of the manner in which he had saved them from destruction. The princes Bahman and Pervez and the prince Parizade, who knew no other father, paid all the honors in his funeral obsequies which love and filial gratitude required. Satisfied with the abundant fortune he had left them, they lived together in perfect harmony, free from ambition for court favor or the places of honor and dignity which they might easily have obtained. One day, when the two princes were hunting, and the princess had remained at home, a devout old woman came to the gate, and asked leave to go in to say her prayers, it being then the hour. The princess ordered her servants to show her into the oratory, which had been fitted up in the house, because there was no mosque in the neighborhood. After the good woman had finished her prayers, she was brought into the great hall before the princess, who asked her many questions about herself, and ended by asking what she thought of the house and how she liked it. "Madam," answered the devout woman, "if you give me leave to speak freely, I will take the liberty to tell you that this house would be incomparable if it had 3 things which are now lacking. The first is the speaking bird, so singular a creature that it draws around it all the singing birds of the neighborhood. The second is the singing tree, the leaves of which are so many mouths, which form a harmonious concert of different voices that never are silent. The third is the yellow water, of a gold color, of which a single drop, when poured into a vessel properly prepared, immediately fills it and rises up in the middle like a fountain, which continuously plays, yet never overflows the basin." "Ah, my good mother," cried the princess, "how much obliged I am to you for a knowledge of these curious things. I never before heard that there were such wonderful rarities in the world. Pray, do me the favor to inform me where they are to be found." "Madam," replied the good woman, "all these curiosities are to be found in the same spot, near the borderline of this kingdom and India. The road lies before your own house, and whoever you send needs but follow it for 20 days, and on the 20th He has only to ask the first person he meets where the speaking bird, singing tree, and yellow water are, and he will be informed. Hey, Nameless, welcome. Glad you could make it, my friend. After saying this, she took her leave and went her way. The Princess Parazade's thoughts were so filled with her desire to possess these three wonders that when her brothers returned from hunting, they were amazed to find her pensive and weighed down as by some secret trouble. At first, she would make no answer to their anxious inquiries, but on being further urged, she said, I always believed that this house which our father built for us was so complete that it lacked nothing. But today I have learned that it wants three rarities, the speaking bird, the singing tree, and the yellow water. Then she explained the peculiar qualities of these three wonders, and asked her brothers to find some trustworthy person in search of them, or to send some trustworthy person in search of them. Sister, replied Prince Bauman, I myself will undertake this search. Only tell me the place and the way to it, and I will set out tomorrow. The next morning, having commended his sister to his brother's care, Prince Bauman mounted his horse, and Purvis and the princess embraced him and wished him a good journey. But in the midst of their adieus, the princess bethought herself of the perils to which he might be exposed. Brother, said she, who knows whether I shall ever see you again? Give up this journey. I would rather never have the speaking bird, singing tree, and yellow water than run the risk of losing you. Sister, replied Bauman, smiling at her sudden fears, my mind is made up, and you cannot dissuade me. However, since I may fail in this undertaking, I will leave you this knife, which has a singular property. If, when you draw it from the sheath, it is clean as now, it will be a sign that I am alive. But if it is stained with blood, then you may believe me dead. Thereupon Bauman rode away, and never turned to the right hand or to the left, but went directly forward toward India. On the 20th day he perceived a very singular old man sitting by the wayside under a tree. His eyebrows were white as snow, as was also his beard, which reached down to his feet. The nails of his hands and feet had grown to an enormous length. A broad umbrella covered his head, and his only clothing was a mat thrown around his body. This old man was a dervish, for many years retired from the world and devoted to meditation, until he had become as above described. When he had drawn near the dervish, Prince Bauman stopped and alighted according to the directions which the devout woman had given the Princess Parizade, and saluting him said, God prolong your days, good father, and grant the accomplishment of your desires. The dervish returned the prince's salutation, but spoke so unintelligibly that he could not understand one word that he said. Perceiving that the trouble was caused by the dervish's hair which hung over his mouth, Prince Bauman drew out a pair of scissors that he had about him, and said, Good dervish, I want to have some talk with you, but your hair prevents my understanding what you say. With your consent I will cut off some part of it. The dervish made no objection, and when the prince had cut off as much hair as he thought fit, he perceived that the dervish no longer seemed so very old. Good dervish, said he, if I had a glass I would show you how young you look. You are now a man, but before anybody could tell what you were. Sir, replied the dervish with a smile, whoever you are, I am obliged to you for your kind service. Tell me in what way I may show my gratitude. Good dervish, replied Prince Bauman, I am in search of the speaking bird, the singing tree, and the yellow water. I know that these three rarities are not far from here, but cannot tell exactly where they are to be found. If you know the place, I beg of you to show me the way. While the prince was speaking, the dervish changed countenance and cast down his eyes, looking very serious. At last he broke his silence. Sir, he said to the Prince Bauman, I know the way you ask of me, but the dangers are far greater than you may suppose. A number of gentlemen as courageous as yourself have asked me the same question. I can assure you they have all perished, for I have not seen one come back. If you have any regard for your life, take my advice and return home. Nothing that you could say, replied Prince Bauman, can persuade me to change my purpose. Since you know the way, I once more beg you to inform me. The dervish put his hand into a bag which lay beside him, and pulled out a bowl. "Since you will not be led by my advice," said he, "take this bowl. When you have mounted your horse, throw the bowl before you and follow it to the foot of the mountains. As soon as the bowl stops, alight, leave your horse with the bridle over his neck, and he will stand in the same place until you return. As you ascend, you will see on your right and left a number of large black stones, and will hear on all sides a confusion of voices, which will utter 1,000 injurious threats. Do not be afraid, but above all things do not turn your head to look behind you, for if you do, you will instantly be changed into a black stone like the others, all of which are young men who have failed in the same enterprise. If you escape this danger and reach the top of the mountain, you will see a cage, and in that cage is the bird you seek. Ask him which are the singing tree and the yellow water, and he will tell you. I have nothing more to say except to beg you, once again, not to risk your life." After these words, the prince mounted his horse, took a respectful leave of the dervish, and threw the bowl before him. The bowl rolled away with such swiftness that Prince Bahman was forced to put his horse to a gallop to avoid losing sight of it. When it stopped at the foot of the mountain, the prince alighted, laid the bridle on his horse's neck, and, having first surveyed the mountain and seen the black stones, began to ascend. He had not gone 4 steps before he heard voices of invisible speakers shouting in tones like thunder, "Stop him! Catch him! Kill him! Thief! Assassin! Murderer!" While some, in a taunting tone, cried, "No, no, don't hurt him. Let the pretty fellow pass. The cage and bird are waiting for him." In spite of these threatening voices, Prince Bahman continued for some time to ascend with courage and resolution. But the voices became such a terrifying din that at last he was seized with dread. His legs trembled under him, and forgetting the dervish's advice, he turned about to run down the hill, and was instantly changed into a black stone, as was also his horse at the same moment. From the time of Prince Bahman's departure, the Princess Parizade always wore the knife in her girdle, and pulled it out several times a day to know whether her brother was yet alive. On the fatal day that Prince Bahman was turned into stone, the princess, while talking with Prince Perviz, drew out the knife as usual, and was horrified at the sight of blood running down the point. "Ah, my dear brother," cried she, "woe's me! I have been the cause of your death, and shall never see you more. Why did I listen to the idle tales of a silly old woman?" Prince Perviz was as much distressed by the death of Prince Bahman as the princess, but as he knew that she still passionately desired the speaking bird, the singing tree, and the yellow water, he interrupted her, saying, "Sister, our regret for our brother is vain and useless. Our grief cannot restore him to life. But why should you doubt the truth of what the holy woman told you? Our brother's death is probably due to some error on his part. I am determined myself to take up the search, and shall set out tomorrow." The princess did her best to dissuade Prince Perviz, but her remonstrances had no effect upon him. Before starting, he gave her a string of 100 pearls, telling her that if the pearls would not run when she counted them upon the string, but remained fixed, that would be a sure sign that he had met with the same fate as his brother. On the 20th day, Prince Perviz met the same dervish in the same place as his brother Bahman had done before, and asked him the same question. The dervish warned him of the same difficulties, and urged him, as he had urged Prince Bahman, to return home, telling him that a young gentleman who very much resembled him had come on the same enterprise a short time before, and had not yet returned. "Good dervish," answered Prince Perviz, "the man of whom you speak was my elder brother. I have learned of his death, but I do not know from what cause." "I can tell you that," replied the dervish. "He was changed into a black stone like all the others, and you will meet the same fate unless you follow my advice more carefully than your brother did. But once more I beg of you to renounce your purpose." "Dervish," said Prince Perviz, "I am grateful for your kind caution, but I cannot give up this enterprise. Therefore I beg that you will do me the same favor that you did my brother." On this, the dervish gave a bowl to the prince, who flung it before his horse, and spurring him forward, followed in pursuit. When the bowl stopped at the bottom of the hill, the prince alighted and, gathering up his courage, started to ascend. But before he had taken 6 steps, he heard a voice just behind him, saying in an insulting tone, "Stay, rash youth, that I may punish you for your presumption." Forgetting the dervish's advice, the prince clapped his hand upon his sword and whirled about to avenge the insult. But he scarcely had time to see that nobody followed him before he and his horse were changed into black stones. Meanwhile, the Princess Parizade counted her chaplet several times a day to assure herself that the pearls would still slide. On the day that Prince Purvis was changed to stone, she was counting over the pearls as usual, when all at once they became immovably fixed, a sure sign that the prince, her brother, was dead. As she had already determined what to do if this should happen, she wasted no time in outward grief, but at once proceeded to disguise herself in her brother's clothes, mounted her horse, and took the same road as her brothers. On the 20th day, she also met the dervish, as her brothers had done, and asked him the same question, and received the same answer, with the same warning against the folly of risking her life in such a search. The princess replied, "If I understand you correctly, the only obstacles to success are, first, getting up to the cage without being frightened by that terrible din of voices, and secondly, not to look behind me. As for this last direction, I hope that I shall have enough self-control to obey it, but for the first, I should like to know if it is allowable to use a stratagem against those voices." "And what stratagem would you employ?" said the dervish. "I would stop my ears with cotton," answered the princess, "so that the voices, however loud and terrible, will be unable to perturb my mind and unbalance my reason." "Good friend," replied the dervish, "you are at liberty to make the experiment, but I would advise you not to expose yourself to such danger." After thanking the dervish, the princess mounted her horse, threw down the bowl which the dervish had given her, and followed it until it stopped at the foot of the mountain. The princess alighted, stopped her ears with cotton, and boldly began the ascent. She heard the voices, and the higher she went, the louder and more numerous they became. But thanks to the cotton, they failed to make any impression on her. Instead, she only laughed at the rude speeches and insulting accusations. At last she saw the cage and the bird, while at the same moment the thunder of invisible voices greatly increased. The princess, encouraged by the sight of the bird she sought, redoubled her speed, and running directly to the cage and clapping her hands upon it, cried, "Bird, I have you, and you shall not escape me." At the same moment, the voices ceased. When Parizade drew the cotton from her ears, the bird said, "Heroic princess, since I am destined to be a slave, I would rather be yours than any other person's, since you have won me so courageously. I know who you are, for you are not what you seem, and I will some day tell you more. Meanwhile, I promise entire obedience to all your commands." "Bird," said Parizade, "I have been told that there is not far off a golden water possessing wonderful properties. Before all things, I ask you to tell me where to find it." The bird showed her the place, which was close by. So she went, and filled a little silver flagon which she had with her. Returning to the bird, she said, "Bird, is this not enough? I want also the singing tree. Tell me where I may find that." "Turn around," said the bird, "and you will see behind you a wood in which you will find this tree. Break off a branch, carry it home, and plant it in your garden. It will at once take root, and will soon grow into a fine tree." The princess went into the wood, and guided by the harmonious concert which she heard, soon discovered the singing tree. Having broken off a branch, she returned again to the bird, and said, "Bird, what you have done for me is not yet enough. My 2 brothers, while searching for you, were transformed into black stones on the mountainside. Tell me how I may undo this enchantment." The bird seemed most reluctant to inform the princess on this point, but when she threatened to take her own life, he told her to sprinkle every stone on her way down the mountain with a drop of the golden water. This she did, and every stone she touched was changed back into a man or a horse ready saddled and bridled. Among them were her 2 brothers, who greeted her with much rejoicing. After explaining to her brothers and the other noble youths the means by which she had rescued them, Parizade placed herself at the head of the procession, which day by day lessened its numbers, since the youths who had come from different countries took leave of the princess one after another as they came to the roads leading to their homes. As soon as the princess reached home, she placed the cage in the garden, and no sooner had the bird begun to warble than he was surrounded by nightingales, larks, linnets, goldfinches, and every species of bird in the country. And no sooner was the branch of the singing tree planted than it took root and quickly became a large tree, the leaves of which gave as harmonious a concert as those of the parent tree. A large basin of beautiful marble was placed in the garden, into which the princess poured the yellow water, which swelled and swelled until it overtopped the edges of the basin and formed in the middle a fountain 20 feet high, perpetually falling back without ever overflowing. Some days later, the 2 princes, having recovered from the fatigue of their journey, mounted their horses to indulge in their usual diversion of hunting, this time several miles from their own estate. As it chanced, the Sultan of Persia came in pursuit of game upon the same ground. Taken by surprise at a narrow point in the way, they hastened to alight and prostrate themselves before the Sultan, who commanded them to rise. Admiring the easy and graceful air with which they rose and stood before him, the Sultan asked who they were and where they lived. "Sire," said Prince Bahman, "we are the sons of the late keeper of your Majesty's gardens, and live in a house which he built shortly before he died." "I perceive," said the Sultan, "that you love hunting." "Sire," replied Prince Bahman, "it is our common exercise, and one which none of your Majesty's subjects who intend to bear arms in your armies can afford to neglect." The Sultan, charmed with so prudent an answer, invited the 2 brothers to join him in the hunt. And such skill did they show with their javelins that the delighted monarch invited them to make him a visit. To his great surprise, they begged to be excused, and when pressed for a reason, Prince Bahman explained that they had a younger sister with whom they lived in such perfect union that they never did anything without first consulting her. "I commend your brotherly affection," answered the Sultan. "Consult your sister by all means. Meet me here tomorrow and give me your answer." The princes went home, but neglected to tell the Princess Parizade about their adventure in meeting the Sultan and the honor he had done them in asking them to visit him. But they did not fail the next morning to meet him as agreed. They confessed that they had forgotten to tell their sister, and begged to be excused. The Sultan graciously forgave them, but again made them promise to bring an answer on the morrow. The princes were guilty of the same forgetfulness a second time, and although the Sultan was so good-natured as to excuse them once again for their negligence, he nevertheless drew 3 little golden balls from his purse and dropped them into Prince Bahman's bosom. "These balls," said he, smiling, "will prevent you forgetting my request a 3rd time, since the noise they will make by falling on the floor when you undress will remind you." The event happened just as the Sultan foresaw, for when Prince Bahman unloosened his girdle to go to bed, the balls dropped on the floor. He ran into Prince Purvis's chamber, and then together they went into Princess Parizade's apartment, and told her all the circumstances of their meeting the Sultan. The princess was much surprised at the news. "It was on my account, I know," she said, "that you refused the Sultan, and I fully appreciate that it was because of your affection for me. But it is dangerous to oppose monarchs in their desires, and if I should dissuade you from visiting him, it might anger him, and in the end make myself and both of you miserable. Before we decide anything, let us consult the speaking bird, for he is wise and has promised to help us in all difficulties." The princess sent for the cage, and after explaining the circumstances, asked the bird what they ought to do. The bird replied, "The princes, your brothers, must accept the Sultan's invitation, and then, in their turn, invite him to come and see your house. The next morning, they again met the Sultan, and Prince Bahman said, "Sire, your Majesty may dispose of us as you please, for we not only easily obtained our sister's consent, but she rebuked us for consulting her in a question of our duty to your Majesty. But if we have offended, we hope you will pardon us." "Do not be uneasy on that score," replied the Sultan. "I highly approve of your conduct, and only hope that you will show me the same deference you show your sister, if I am to have a share of your friendship." The Sultan gave orders to return at once to his palace. He made the princes ride one on each side of him, and when they entered the capital, the eyes of the people, who stood in crowds in the street, were fixed on the two young strangers, and they were eager to know who they might be, and many wished that their Sultan had been blessed with two such handsome sons. Upon reaching the palace, the Sultan led the princes through the principal apartments, and they showed a nice appreciation of the beauty of the rooms and the richness of the furniture and ornaments. Afterward, a magnificent repast was served up, and the Sultan made them sit with him, and was so pleased with their wit and judgment that he said to himself, "Were these my own sons, they could not be more accomplished or better informed." When night approached, the two princes prostrated themselves at the Sultan's feet, and thanked him for the favors he had heaped upon them. Before they went out of the Sultan's presence, Prince Bahman said, "Sire, may we presume to request that you will do us and our sister the honor to visit us the next time that you are hunting in our neighborhood? Our house is not worthy of your presence, but monarchs have sometimes stooped to take shelter in a cottage." "My children," replied the Sultan, "your house cannot be otherwise than beautiful and worthy of its owners. I will call and see it with pleasure, and no later than tomorrow. Early in the morning I shall be where I first saw you. Meet me there, and you shall be my guides." When the Princess Parizade learned from her brothers that the Sultan was to call at their house the next day, she said, "We must plan at once to prepare a repast fit for his Majesty, and for that purpose we must consult the speaking bird, for perhaps he can tell us what meats the Sultan likes." "Good mistress," said the bird, "you have excellent cooks. Let them do the best they can. But above all things, let them prepare a dish of cucumbers stuffed with pearls, which must be set before the Sultan as a first course." "Cucumbers stuffed with pearls!" cried the princess. "That is an unheard of dish. Besides, all the pearls that I have would not be enough." "As for that," said the bird, "go early tomorrow to the park, and dig at the foot of the first tree on your right, and you will find more pearls than you want." In the morning the princess followed the bird's instructions, taking the gardener with her. When the gardener had dug to a certain depth at the foot of the first tree on the right, he discovered a gold box about a foot square, which he placed in the hands of the princess. Upon opening it, she found it full of pearls. As soon as she entered the house, she called the head cook, and after giving him general instructions about the entertainment for the Sultan, she added, "Besides all this, you must dress an extraordinary dish to set before the Sultan himself. This dish must be of cucumbers stuffed with these pearls." At the same time, she opened the box and showed the pearls. The chief cook, who had never heard of such a dish, started back in amazement, but finding nothing to say in reply, took the box and retired. The same day, the two princes met the Sultan at the place appointed, and while Prince Bahman stayed to conduct him to their house, Prince Pervis rode ahead to announce that he was approaching. When the Sultan entered the courtyard and alighted at the portico, the princess came and threw herself at his feet. The Sultan stooped to raise her, and after he had gazed for some time at her beauty, he said, "The brothers are worthy of the sister, and she is worthy of them. I am no longer amazed that the brothers would do nothing without their sister's consent." After the princess had led the Sultan through all the rooms of the house except the hall, and he had duly considered them and admired their variety, he begged to see the garden. So the princess opened a door which led into the garden, and conducted him to the spot where the singing tree was planted. And there the Sultan heard a concert different from any he had ever heard before. "My daughter," he said to the princess, Where are the musicians whom I hear? Are they underground or invisible in the air? Such excellent performers should not remain unseen. Sire, said the princess, smiling, they are not musicians, but the leaves of the tree your majesty sees before you, which makes this music, as you yourself will be convinced if you draw nearer. The sultan went nearer and was so charmed with the sweet harmony that he begged the princess to tell him the name of the wonderful tree, and when and where she had obtained it. Sire, replied the princess, this tree has no other name than that of the singing tree, and it is not a native of this country. Its history is connected with the yellow water and the speaking bird, which came to me at the same time, and which your majesty may see after you have rested yourself. And if it pleases you, I will then relate the history of these rarities. My daughter, replied the sultan, my fatigue is all forgotten at the sight of the wonderful things you have shown me. I am impatient to see the yellow water and to admire the speaking bird. When the sultan came to the yellow water, he was so fascinated by the wonderful sight that he could hardly tear his gaze away from it. But after the princess had described its strange properties, he at last turned reluctantly away, saying, Well, this is enough for one time. I promised myself the pleasure to come and visit it often. But now, let us go and see the speaking bird. As he went toward the hall, the sultan perceived a prodigious number of birds in the trees around, filling the air with their warblings, and asked the reason. The princess explained that they came from all parts to accompany the song of the speaking bird, which the sultan could now see in a cage in one of the windows of the hall. As the sultan and the Princess Parizade entered the hall, the princess raised her voice and said, My slave, here is the sultan. Pay your compliments to him. The bird immediately ceased singing and said, God save the sultan. Long may he live. As the repast was served near the window where the bird was placed, the sultan replied as he took his seat, Bird, I thank you, and am overjoyed to find in you the sultan of the race of birds. When the sultan saw the dish of cucumbers set before him, he reached out his hand and took one, but upon cutting it, he was extremely surprised to find it stuffed with pearls. What novelty is this, he asked, and what is the purpose of stuffing cucumbers with pearls, since pearls cannot be eaten? He looked at the two princes and the princess to ask them the meaning, but at this moment the bird interrupted him and said, How can your majesty be so greatly astonished at cucumbers stuffed with pearls, which you see with your own eyes, when you so easily believed that the queen, your own wife, was the mother of a dog, a cat, and a stick of wood? I believed those things, replied the sultan, because the nurses assured me of the facts. Those nurses, sire, replied the bird, were the queen's two sisters, who were envious of her happiness, and imposed upon your majesty's credulity to satisfy their desire of revenge. If you question them, they will confess their crime. The two brothers and the sister whom you see before you are your own children, who were rescued by the keeper of your gardens and adopted by him. Bird, cried the sultan, I believe that you have disclosed the truth to me. The attraction which I felt toward the princes and princesses shows plainly that they must be my own kin. Come, my sons, come, my daughter, let me embrace you, and give you the first marks of a father's love and tenderness. When the banquet was over, and the sultan about to depart, he said, My children, you see in me your father. Tomorrow I will bring the queen your mother. Therefore, prepare to receive her. The sultan's first act upon returning to his palace was to command the grand vizier to seize the queen's two sisters. They were taken from their homes, convicted and condemned, and executed within an hour. Meanwhile, the Sultan Kunu Shah, followed by all the lords of his court, went on foot to take the queen from the strict confinement in which she had languished for so many years. I have come, said he, with tears in his eyes, to entreat your pardon for the injustice I have done you. I have already punished your cruel sisters, who so wickedly deceived me, and I hope soon to present to you two accomplished princes and a lovely princess. Come and resume your former rank, with all the honors which are your due. Immediately the joyous news was spread throughout the city. Early next morning, the Sultan and the Queen went with all their court to the house built by the keeper of the gardens, where the Sultan presented the Princes Bahman and Perviz and the Princess Parizade to their rejoicing mother. The tears flowed plentifully down the cheeks of all present, but especially of the Queen, because of her great joy at having two such princes for her sons, and such a princess for her daughter. When the Sultan returned to his capital, he rode with the Princes Bahman and Perviz on his right hand, and with the Queen and Princess at his left, preceded and followed by all the officers of his court. Crowds of people came out to meet them, and with shouts of joy ushered them into the city, where all eyes were focused, not only upon the Queen and her two sons and daughter, but also upon the speaking bird which the princess carried in its cage, while countless other birds, drawn by his sweet notes, followed, flitting from tree to tree, and from one housetop to another. So the Princes Bahman and Perviz and the Princess Parizade were brought to the palace with fitting pomp, and all night long there were illuminations and rejoicings, not only in the palace and in all parts of the city, but extending throughout the empire of Persia. Let me use a throat lozenge real quick. Gotta say that Sultan's incredibly gullible. I mean, he basically just believes whatever the most recent thing he was told was. And how's that for a reunion? Oh, wife, a bird told me I was wrong, so I killed your family. But here's your kids back that you missed out on, their entire lives. And you want to be my spouse again? Poor lady. I mean, it's not like she gets a choice in the whole story either. Did remind me a bit of the Odyssey, though. Honestly, a lot of these have reminded me of the Odyssey. Story of the Cyclops, the transformations, the auditory danger that the hero or heroine stops by stopping up their ears and proceeding on to whatever the treasure was. Wonder if there's some story at the root of all of those. Be kind of a cool thing. Track the stories through history. Find out where they originated. So, next up is the story of Prince Ahmed and Peri Banu. I think that's how you say it. Periebebanou. Peri Banu. So, there once was a sultan of India who had 3 sons and 1 niece, the ornaments of his court. The eldest of the princes was called Hussein, the second Ali, the youngest Ahmed, and the princess his niece Nouroniar. Nouronnihar. Anyway, the Princess Nouronnihar, having lost her father while she was still very young, had been brought up by the Sultan, and now that she was grown to womanhood, the Sultan thought of marrying her to some prince worthy of the alliance. She was very beautiful, and when the Sultan's idea became known, the princes informed him, singly, that they loved her and would fain marry her. This discovery pained the Sultan, because he knew that there would be jealousy among his son. I was gonna read one more, or at least until the hour mark. I'm going to try and get back to the way I was reading before, before I got to this time of year, I guess. But I've fallen out of the habit of reading for this long aloud, so my throat got a bit scratchy, which is why I needed the lozenge. Hey, Panda. He therefore sent for each separately and spoke with them, urging him to abide permanently by the lady's choice, but none of them would yield without a struggle. Okay, I'm hoping that she's like a distant niece. All good, Sparky. Thanks, Panda. I appreciate that. As he found them obstinate, he sent for them all together and said, "My children, since I have not been able to dissuade you from aspiring to marry the princess, your cousin, and as I have no inclination to use my authority to give her to one in preference to his brothers, I trust I have thought of an expedient which will please all of you and preserve harmony among you, if you will but hear me and follow my advice. I think it would not be amiss if you were to travel separately into different countries, so that you might not meet each other. And, as you know, I am very curious and delight in everything that is rare and singular. I promise my niece in marriage to him who shall bring me the most extraordinary rarity." The three princes, each hoping that fortune would be favorable to him, consented to this proposal. The Sultan gave them money, and early the next morning they started from the city, disguised as merchants. They departed by the same gate, each attended by a trusty servant, and for one day they journeyed together. Then they halted at a khan, and having agreed to meet in 1 year's time at the same place, they said farewell, and early the next morning started on their several journeys. Prince Hussein, the eldest brother, who had heard the wonders of the extent, power, riches, and splendor of the kingdom of Bisnagar, bent his course toward the Indian coast, and after 3 months' traveling, sometimes over deserts and barren mountains, and sometimes through populous and fertile countries, he arrived at Bisnagar, the capital of the kingdom of that name, and the residence of his Maharaja. He lodged at a khan appointed for foreign merchants, and having learnt that there were 4 principal divisions where merchants of all sorts kept their shops, in the midst of which stood the Maharaja's palace, surrounded by 3 courts, and each gate distant 2 leagues from the other, he went to one of these quarters the next day. It was large, divided into several streets, all vaulted and shaded from the sun, but yet very light. The shops were all of the same size and proportion, and all who dealt in the same sort of goods, as well as all the artists of the same profession, lived in one street. Prince Hussein marveled at the variety and richness of the articles exposed for sale, and as he wandered from street to street, he wondered still more, for on all sides he saw the products of every country in the world. Silks, porcelain, and precious stones in abundance indicated the enormous wealth of the people. Another object which Prince Hussein particularly admired was the great number of flower sellers who crowded the streets, for the Indians are such great lovers of flowers that not one will stir without a nosegay in his hand or a garland on his head, and as the merchants keep them in pots in their shops, so that the air of the whole quarter is beautifully perfumed. Prince Hussein had finished his inspection when a merchant, perceiving him passing with weary steps, asked him to sit down in his shop. Before long a crier came past, carrying a piece of carpet for which he asked 40 purses of gold. It was only about 6 feet square, and the prince was astonished at the price. "Surely," said he, "there must be something very extraordinary about this carpet, which I cannot see, for it looks ordinary enough." "You have guessed right, sir," replied the crier, "and will own it when you learn that whoever sits on this piece of carpeting may be transported in an instant whithersoever he desires to be, without being stopped by any obstacle." The prince was overjoyed, for he had found a rarity which would secure him the hand of the princess. "If," said he, "the carpet has this virtue, I will gladly buy it." "Sir," replied the crier, "I have told you the truth, and it will be an easy matter to convince you. I will spread the carpeting, and when we have both sat down, and you have formed the wish to be transported into your apartment at the Khan, if we are not conveyed thither, it shall be no bargain." Sorry if you heard me crunching the lozenge. On this assurance of the crier, the prince accepted the conditions and concluded the bargain. Then, having obtained the shopkeeper's leave, they went into his back shop, where they both sat down on the carpeting. And as soon as the prince had formed his wish to be transported into his apartment at the Khan, he in an instant found himself and the crier there. As he wanted not a more convincing proof of the virtue of the carpeting, he counted out to the crier 40 purses of gold, and gave him 20 pieces for himself. In this manner, Prince Hussein became the possessor of the carpeting, and was overjoyed at having so speedily found something worth bringing to his father. He could at will have transported himself to the Khan, where he had parted from his brothers, but, knowing that they would not have returned, he decided to tarry in the city and study the manners and customs of the people. He gained much satisfaction and information from visiting the different buildings and witnessing the various ceremonies which took place. He thus became the spectator of a solemn festival attended by a multitude of Hindus. This great assembly, encamped in variously colored tents on a plain of vast extent, as far as the eye could reach, formed an imposing sight, and he also presented himself at the court of the Maharaja, by whose wealth he was greatly impressed. All these things made a stay at Bisnagar very pleasant, but he desired to be nearer to the Princess Nurinihar, whom he most ardently loved, and he considered that he could rely upon claiming her as his bride. Therefore, although he might have remained in the city much longer, he paid his reckoning at the Khan, spread the carpet upon the floor of his room, and he and his attendant were instantly transported to the meeting place from which he had set out. Prince Ali, the second brother, joined a caravan, and in 4 months arrived at Shiraz, which was then the capital of the Empire of Persia. And having on the way contracted a friendship with some merchants, he passed for a jeweler and lodged in the same khan with them. On the morning after his arrival, Prince Ali started to inspect the valuables which were exposed for sale in the quarter where the jewelers lodged. He was astonished by all the wealth which he saw, and he wandered from street to street, lost in admiration. But what surprised him most was a crier, who walked to and fro, carrying an ivory tube in his hand, for which he asked 40 purses of gold. Prince Ali thought the man mad, but he was anxious to find out why the tube was so expensive. "Sir," said the crier when the prince addressed him, "this tube is furnished with a glass. By looking through it, you will see whatever object you wish to behold." The crier presented the tube for his inspection, and he, wishing to see his father, looked through it and beheld the Sultan in perfect health, sitting on his throne in his council chamber. Next, he wished to see the Princess Nurinihar, and immediately he saw her laughing among her companions. Prince Ali wanted no other proof to persuade him that this tube was the most valuable article, not only in the city of Shiraz, but in all the world, and believed that if he should neglect to purchase it, he should never meet with an equally wonderful curiosity. He said to the crier, "I will purchase this tube from you for 40 purses. He then took him to the khan where he lodged, and told him out the money, and became the possessor of the magic tube. Prince Ali was overjoyed with this purchase, and persuaded himself that, as his brothers would not be able to meet with anything so rare and admirable, the Princess Nurinihar must be the recompense for the fatigues of his travels. While he was waiting for the caravan to start on its return journey, he visited the court of Persia and saw all the wonders in the neighborhood of the city. When all was ready, he joined his friends and arrived happily, without any accident or trouble, at the meeting place where he found Prince Hussein. Oh no, I think about a tea. Rip, there goes the tea. Oh well. There they tarried, waiting for Prince Ahmed. Prince Ahmed took the road to Samarkand. The day after his arrival, as he went through the city, he saw a crier who had an artificial apple in his hand, for which he demanded 35 purses of gold. "Let me see that apple," said the prince, "and tell me what virtue or extraordinary property it possesses to be valued at so high a rate." "Sir," replied the crier, giving it into his hand, "if you look at the mere outside of this apple, it is not very remarkable. But if you consider its properties and the great use and benefit it is to mankind, you will say it is invaluable, and that he who possesses it is master of a great treasure. It cures all sick persons of the most mortal diseases, and this merely by the patient's smelling it." "If one may believe you," replied Prince Ahmed, "the virtues of this apple are wonderful, and it is indeed valuable. But what proof have you of what you say?" "Sir," replied the crier, "the truth is known to the whole city of Samarkand." While the crier was detailing to Prince Ahmed the virtues of the artificial apple, many persons gathered about them and confirmed what he declared. And one amongst the rest said he had a friend who was dangerously ill and whose life was despaired of, which might be a favorable opportunity to try the experiment. Thereupon Prince Ahmed told the crier he would give him 40 purses for the apple, if it cured the sick person merely by smelling it. The crier said to Prince Ahmed, "Come, sir, let us go and make the experiment, and the apple shall be yours." The experiment succeeded, and the prince, after he had counted out to the crier 40 purses, and had received the apple from him in return, waited with the greatest impatience for the departure of a caravan for the Indies. In the meantime he saw all that was curious at and about Samarkand, and when a caravan set out he joined it, and arrived safely at the appointed place where the princes Hussein and Ali waited for him. When Prince Ahmed joined his brothers, they embraced with tenderness, and expressed much joy at meeting again. Then Prince Hussein said, "Brothers, let us postpone the narrative of our travels, and let us at once show each other what we have brought as a curiosity, that we may do ourselves justice beforehand, and judge to which of us our father may give the preference. To set the example, I will tell you that the rarity which I have brought from the kingdom of Bisnagar is the carpeting upon which I sit. It looks but ordinary and makes no show, but it possesses wonderful virtues. Whoever sits on it and desires to be transported to any place is immediately carried thither. I made the experiment myself before I paid the 40 purses, which I most readily gave for it. I expect now that you will tell me whether what you have brought is to be compared with this carpet." Prince Ali spoke next and said, "I must own that your carpet is very wonderful. Yet I am as well satisfied with my purchase as you can possibly be with yours. Here is an ivory tube which also cost me 40 purses. It looks ordinary enough, yet on gazing through it you can behold whatever you desire to see, no matter how far distant it may be. Take it, brother, and try for yourself." Hussein took the ivory tube from Prince Ali, with the intention of seeing the Princess Nouranar. Suddenly, Ali and Prince Ahmed, who had kept their faces fixed upon him, were extremely surprised to see his countenance change in such a manner as to express extraordinary alarm and affliction, and he cried out, "Alas! Princes, to what purpose have we undertaken such long and fatiguing journeys, with but the hope of being recompensed by the possession of the charming Nouranar, when in a few moments that lovely princess will breathe her last? I saw her in her bed, surrounded by her women all in tears, who gave every evidence of expecting her death. Take the tube, behold yourselves the miserable state she is in, and mingle your tears with mine." Prince Ali took the tube out of Hussein's hand, and after he had seen the same object, with sensible grief presented it to Ahmed, who took it, to behold the melancholy sight which so much concerned them all. When Prince Ahmed had taken the tube out of Ali's hands, and he had seen the Princess Nur-Nahar's end was so near, he addressed himself to his two brothers, saying, "Brothers, the Princess Nur-Nahar is indeed at death's door, but provided we lose no time, we may preserve her life." He then took the artificial apple out of his bosom and resumed, "This apple cost me as much as the carpet or tube, and has healing properties. If a sick person smells it, though in the last agonies, it will restore him to perfect health immediately. I have made the experiment and could show you its wonderful effect on the person of the Princess Nur-Nahar, if we hasten to assist her." The Princes Ali and Ahmed sat down by Hussein, and as their interest was the same, they all framed the same wish, and were transported instantaneously into the Princess Nur-Nahar's chamber. The presence of three princes, who were so little expected, alarmed the princess's women, who could not comprehend by what enchantment 3 strange men should be among them, for they did not know them at first. Prince Ahmed no sooner saw himself in Nur-Nahar's chamber, and perceived the princess dying, than he rose off the carpet and went to the bedside, and put the apple to her nostrils. The princess instantly opened her eyes and asked to be dressed, with the same freedom and naturalness as if she had wakened out of a sound sleep. Her women presently informed her that she was obliged to the 3 princes, her cousins, and particularly to Prince Ahmed, for the sudden recovery of her health. She immediately expressed her joy at seeing them, and thanked them all together, but afterward Prince Ahmed in particular. As she desired to dress, the princes hastened to express the pleasure they felt at her recovery. A repast was served to them, after which they retired. While the princess was dressing, the princes went to throw themselves at their father's feet, but when they came to him, they found he had been previously informed of their unexpected arrival, and by what means the princess had been so suddenly cured. The Sultan received and embraced them with the greatest joy, both for their return and the wonderful recovery of the princess, his niece, who had been given up by the physicians. After the usual compliments, each of the princes presented the rarity which he had brought. Prince Hussein his carpet, Prince Ali his ivory tube, and Prince Ahmed the artificial apple. And after each had commended his present, as he put it into the Sultan's hand, they begged of him to pronounce their fate, and declare to which of them he would give the Princess Nur-Nahar, according to his promise. The Sultan of the Indies, having heard all that the princes had to say, remained some time silent, considering what answer he should make. At last he said to them in terms full of wisdom, "I would declare for one of you, my children, if I could do it with justice. But let us consider. It is true, Ahmed, the princess is beholden to your artificial apple for her cure. But let me ask you, whether you could have been of such service to her if you had not known by Ali's tube the danger she was in, and Hussein's carpet had not brought you to her so soon. Your tube, Ali, informed you and your brothers that you were likely to lose the princess, and so far she is greatly obliged to you. You must also grant that the knowledge of her illness would have been no service without the artificial apple and carpet. And as for you, Hussein, the princess would be very ungrateful if she did not show her sense of the value of your carpet, which was so necessary a means toward effecting her cure. But consider, it would have been of little use if you had not been acquainted with her illness by Ali's tube, or if Ahmed had not applied his artificial apple. Therefore, as neither the carpet, the ivory tube, nor the artificial apple has the least preference to the other articles, I cannot grant the princess to any one of you. And the only fruit you have reaped from your travels is the glory of having equally contributed to restore her to health. As this is the case, you see that I must have recourse to other means to determine the choice I ought to make. And as there is time enough between now and night, I will do it today. Go and procure each of you a bow and arrow. Repair to the plain where the horses are exercised. I will soon join you, and will give the Princess Nur-Nahar to him who shoots the farthest." I mean, at that point, why not just flip a coin? The three princes had no objection to the decision of the Sultan. When they were dismissed from his presence, each provided himself with a bow and arrow, and they went to the plain appointed, followed by a great concourse of people. The Sultan did not make them wait long for him. As soon as he arrived, Prince Hussein, as the eldest, took his bow and arrow and shot first. Prince Ali shot next, and far beyond him, and Prince Ahmed last of all. But it so happened that nobody could see where his arrow fell, and notwithstanding all the search made by himself and all the spectators, it was not to be found. Though it was believed he had shot the farthest, still, as Prince Ahmed's arrow could not be found, the Sultan determined in favor of Prince Ali, and gave orders for preparations to be made for the solemnization of the nuptials, which were celebrated a few days after with great magnificence. Prince Hussein would not honor the feast with his presence. He could not bear to see the Princess Nur-Nahar wed Prince Ali, who he said did not deserve her more deeply, nor love her more truly than himself. In short, his grief was so extreme that he left the court, and renounced all right of succession to the crown, to turn dervish and put himself under the discipline of a famous sheikh who had gained great reputation for his exemplary life. Prince Ahmed, urged by the same motive, did not assist at the nuptials of Prince Ali and the Princess Nur-Nahar any more than his brother Hussein. Yet he did not renounce the world as his brother had done. But as he could not imagine what could have become of his arrow, he resolved to search for it, that he might not have anything with which to reproach himself. With this intent he went to the place where the Princes Hussein and Ali's arrows had been gathered up, and proceeding straight forward from thence, looked carefully on both sides as he advanced. He went so far that at last he began to think his labor was in vain. Yet he could not help proceeding till he came to some steep, craggy rocks, which completely barred the way. To his great astonishment he perceived an arrow, which he recognized as his own, at the foot of the rocks. Certainly, he said to himself, neither I nor any man living can shoot an arrow so far. Perhaps fortune, to make amends for depriving me of what I thought the greatest happiness of my life, may have reserved a greater blessing for my comfort. There were many cavities in the rocks, into one of which the prince entered, and looking about, beheld an iron door which he feared was fastened. But pushing against it, it opened and disclosed a stairway, which he descended with his arrow in his hand. At first he thought he was entering a dark place, but presently he became aware of a strange light, quite different from the light of day. Before him was a spacious square, and in the center of it he beheld a magnificent palace. At the same instant a damsel of majestic air and of remarkable beauty advanced across the square, attended by a troop of ladies, all magnificently dressed. As soon as Ahmed perceived the damsel, he hastened to pay his respects, and the lovely lady, seeing him, said, "Come near, Prince Ahmed. You are welcome." Prince Ahmed was surprised at hearing himself addressed by name, but he bowed low and followed into the great hall. Here she seated herself upon a sofa and requested the prince to sit beside her. Then she said, "You are surprised that I know you, yet you cannot be completely unprepared, as the Quran informs you that the world is inhabited by genii as well as men. I am the daughter of one of the most powerful and distinguished of these genii, and my name is Parabanu. I am no stranger to your loves or your travels, since it was I myself who exposed for sale the artificial apple which you bought at Samarkand, the carpet which Prince Hussein purchased at Bisnagar, and the tube which Prince Ali brought from Shiraz. This is sufficient to let you know that I am not unacquainted with everything that relates to you. You seem to me worthy of a more happy fate than that of possessing the Princess Nur-Nahar, and that you might attain it, I carried your arrow to the place where you found it. It is in your power to avail yourself of the favorable opportunity which presents itself to make you happy." Yeah, I might have a little bit of Disney's Aladdin running in my head. You are not alone there, Sparky. Ahmed made no answer to this declaration, but knelt to kiss the hem of her garment. This, however, she would not allow him, and presented her hand, which he kissed 1,000 times, and kept it fast locked in his own. "Well, Prince Ahmed," said she, "will you pledge your faith to me, as I do mine to you?" "Yes, madam," replied the prince, in an ecstasy of joy. "What can I do more fortunate for myself, or with greater pleasure?" "Then," answered the fairy, "you are my husband, and I am your wife. Our fairy marriages are contracted with no other ceremonies, and yet are more indissoluble than those among men, with all their formalities." The fairy Parabenu then connected Prince Ahmed round the palace, where he saw much that delighted him. At last she led him to a rich apartment, in which the marriage feast was spread. The fairy had ordered a sumptuous repast to be prepared, and the prince marveled at the variety and delicacy of the dishes, many of which were quite strange to him. While they ate, there was music, and after dessert a large number of fairies and genii appeared and danced before them. Day after day new amusements were provided, each more entrancing than the last. For the fairy's intention was not only to give the prince convincing proofs of the sincerity of her love, but to let him see that at his father's court he could meet with nothing comparable to the happiness he enjoyed with her. She wished to attach him entirely to herself, and in this attempt she entirely succeeded. At the end of 6 months, Prince Ahmed, who still loved and honored the Sultan his father, felt a great desire to know how he was. He mentioned his wish to the fairy, who, lest this should be an excuse to leave her, begged him to abandon the idea of visiting the capital. "My queen," replied the prince, "since you do not consent that I shall go, I will deny myself the pleasure, and there is nothing to which I would not submit to please you." These words greatly pleased the fairy, but the prince grieved lest his father should think him dead. And I'm sorry, but I gotta stop there. My throat is like fire. I am clearly going to have to work back up to reading for hours. I'm sorry about that. Oh, okay. But we will pick that up again on Wednesday. And I'm thinking that genie has, devious designs. Anybody else think that it's probably an evil spirit? All right. Well, thank you everybody for hanging out with me. I appreciate it, and I hope to catch you guys later. Have a good night, everybody. Or day, or afternoon, or morning, whichever it is. Thanks, fella. All right. I'll catch all of you later.